In this video, you will learn the secret of self-control according to the ideas contained in the book Atomic Habits. So, let's get started. In 1971, during the Vietnam War, it was discovered that more than 15% of soldiers serving in the United States were addicted to heroin. Furthermore, additional research revealed that at least 35% of military personnel in Vietnam had experimented with heroin, and 20% were already addicted. But the problem was even bigger than initially thought. This discovery led the government to create the Special Action Office for Drug Abuse Prevention. This project had the function of promoting prevention and rehabilitation of dependent members and accompanying them until their return home. At one point, one of the researchers in charge, named Lee Robbins, discovered something that would overturn all established beliefs about addiction. What he revealed was that when soldiers who had been heroin users returned home, only 5% resumed their addiction within a year, and only 12% relapsed within 3 years. In other words, 9 out of 10 soldiers who used heroin in Vietnam eliminated their addiction almost overnight upon returning home. Despite this discovery contradicting the prevailing belief at the time that heroin dependence was a permanent and irreversible condition. Researcher Robbins revealed that addictions could disappear spontaneously if there was a radical change in the environment. And this makes perfect sense because in Vietnam, soldiers spent all day surrounded by various stimuli that triggered heroin use. The drug was easily accessible. They lived immersed in the constant stress of war. They formed friendships with other soldiers who were also addicted to heroin. And there was also the fact that they were thousands of miles from home. However, once a soldier returned home, he found himself in an environment completely free of those triggers. When the context changed, the same happened with the habit. A good example of how this works is if we compare this situation with that of a typical drug user. One who was accustomed to using alone at home or with friends, and suddenly is admitted to a clinic to get clean. There, the environment is totally devoid of triggers that could induce the bad habit, and therefore the result is generally very satisfactory. However, what statistics show is that of all heroin users who leave rehabilitation clinics and return home, about 90% end up relapsing, which represents exactly the opposite number of that Vietnam study. You will notice that this information contradicts many of our cultural beliefs about bad habits, because they challenge the conventional idea of associating unhealthy behavior with moral weakness. So, if you are overweight, a smoker, or addicted to something, you have surely heard many times that this is weakness and lack of self-control. It's common to think that just a little discipline would solve all our problems, because this conception is deeply rooted in our culture. But the fact is that some recent research has revealed something different. When researchers analyzed people who appeared to have tremendous self-control, it became evident that these people were not so different from those who had difficulties controlling themselves. What actually happens is that people considered highly disciplined are better at structuring their lives in a way that doesn't require superhuman willpower or gigantic self-control to continue with their good habits. In this way, they spend less time in tempting situations than those other people considered weak and undisciplined. Deep down, people with more self-control are usually those who need to exercise it the least, since it's easier to practice self-control when you don't have to use it very often. Of course, things like persistence, grit, and willpower continue to be essential for success. But the best way to improve these qualities is not by wishing to be more disciplined, but by creating a more disciplined environment. This idea that challenges common sense makes even more sense when you understand what happens when a habit is formed in the brain. A habit that has been encoded in the mind is ready at all times to be used whenever the relevant situation arises. Take as an example this case that happened with a therapist in Austin, Texas. When she started smoking, it was common for her to do it while horseback riding with a friend. But at a certain point in her life, she stopped horseback riding, quit smoking, and stayed away from it for several years. Decades later, when resuming horseback riding, she suddenly began to crave a cigarette for the first time in years. In other words, the stimuli that triggered the desire to smoke was still internalized. She just hadn't been exposed to them for a long time. Once a habit has been encoded, the desire to act arises whenever the environmental stimuli reappear. This is one of the reasons why certain conventional tactics for changing bad behavior can backfire. Shaming obese people with scoldings and presentations about weight loss can make them feel stressed. And as a result, many end up resorting to their favorite remedy against stress, which is eating until they can't take any more. Showing pictures of dark lungs to smokers makes them even more anxious. And they resort to what is for them the best way to deal with anxiety, which is smoking a cigarette. This proves that if you don't pay attention to the stimuli that cause your addiction when trying to solve the problem, you may provoke exactly the behavior you want to stop. Bad habits feed back into themselves. They provoke precisely the feelings they try to numb. It works like this. You feel bad for some reason and therefore eat a pizza. And for having eaten the pizza, you start feeling bad again because you know you shouldn't have eaten it. You feel lazy and therefore go watch TV. But it ends up making you lazier and making you watch even more. Worrying about your health makes you anxious, and this leads you to smoke a cigarette to relieve that anxiety, which will inevitably worsen your health even more, and, as a consequence, will make you feel even more anxious. Bad habits work like a downward spiral, taking you into an increasingly deep hole that's difficult to get out of. Researchers call this phenomenon stimulus-induced desire. It means that an external trigger creates in the person a compulsive desire to repeat the bad habit. In other words, once that person perceives a certain thing, they start to desire that thing. This process happens all the time, often without us even realizing it. Scientists discovered that just showing a picture of cocaine to an addict for just 33 milliseconds was enough to stimulate the brain's reward system and awaken the desire for use. This speed is too fast to be consciously registered by the brain. The addicts couldn't even identify what they had seen, but they still craved the drug. The moral of the story is that you can break a habit, but it's unlikely that you'll forget it. Once the mental grooves of the habit have been created in your brain, they are almost impossible to be completely removed, even if they aren't used for a good while. This means that simply resisting temptation is a not very effective strategy, because it's very difficult to maintain positive habits consistently in a negative environment, since this requires a lot of energy and willpower, which, by the way, are limited resources. In the short term, we can control ourselves well, but in the long term, we end up yielding to the stimuli of the environment in which we live. The most reliable way to eliminate bad habits is by going straight to the root of the problem. And most of the time, it means reducing exposure to the stimuli that trigger them. For example, if instead of studying or working, you can't stop scrolling through social media timelines, leave your phone in another room for a few hours. If you're constantly comparing yourself to others and feeling like a failure, stop following profiles on social media that trigger these negative feelings. Are you wasting a lot of time watching TV? Remove the TV from your bedroom and avoid staying in the living room. If you're staying up all night playing video games or online games and can't stop, store the console in a cabinet after each use and uninstall online games from the computer. You need to remove these stimuli from your field of vision as they awaken your desire without you noticing. This is a simple, yet very effective strategy. Often just by removing a single stimulus, the entire habit simply disappears. Don't rely on willpower to resist temptations, because you will lose this game in the long run. Remember, the secret of self-control is to spend as little time as possible exposed to the stimuli that trigger your bad habits. If this video helped you, don't forget to leave your like, share with those who need it, and subscribe to the channel. Activate the bell to receive notifications of new videos every week. See you in the next video.